Hello and welcome to week 2. So today we're going to be going over the 4 phases within your cycle, the hormone fluctuations within each phase, what each phase means, and some common symptoms that people experience week to week depending on the phase that they're in. And we'll also talk about tracking your cycle in a way that will help you determine where you're at any particular time. So this week will kind of be a general overview of the 4 phases, and then the next following weeks, so week 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're going to get into those 4 phases in depth individually so that you can really see the big picture of what's happening within each phase. So like I mentioned last week, most women today can't really name the phases of their cycle aside from their period and ovulation, but there's a lot going on in between that's just as important, if not more important, than those 2 phases. So those 4 phases are going to be your menstrual phase or your period, your follicular phase, your ovulatory phase or ovulation, and then luteal phase. So follicular is that in-between time between your period and when you ovulate, and then luteal phase is that period between when ovulation ends and then when your next period begins. A lot of people experience PMS symptoms during the luteal phase time. So we'll start with the menstrual phase or your period. It's the most commonly known phase of a woman's cycle, primarily because there's physical evidence that you are in that phase. So as we all know, during your menstrual phase, you bleed. This typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 days sometimes. It varies person to person and even cycle to cycle. So during this phase, a lot of people experience cramps, bloating, headaches, fatigue, irritability. The list goes on, and like I said, it varies person to person and cycle to cycle as well. So this is going to be when your estrogen and your progesterone are at their lowest. The low levels of these 2 hormones actually trigger the beginning of your period. And we're going to talk a lot about these 2 hormones because they're the most important when it comes to figuring out your fluctuations within each phase of your cycle and how to support your body when certain levels are too high or too low. Most people have heard of estrogen and progesterone when it comes to your hormone health, but the other 2 really important hormones that play a factor in this is the follicle stimulating hormone, abbreviated FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, or LH. So the follicle stimulating hormone, we'll say FSH for now, is what is responsible for triggering your follicular phase, which is your next phase of your cycle. So this hormone actually triggers your ovaries to start producing these little follicles or sacs. You produce about 15 to 20 of them. And each of these little follicles contains an immature egg. Now, in short, only one of these eggs will actually make it into the ovulatory phase where it is being prepared to be fertilized, and that leads us into ovulation. So you may experience similar symptoms in your follicular phase because it actually overlaps with the menstrual phase. The first day of your menstrual cycle is also the first day of your follicular phase, but the follicular phase goes past your menstrual cycle until you ovulate. So like I said, the symptoms may be similar, but your energy levels will actually start to rise. During your period, your energy levels are typically at their lowest, but as you enter your follicular phase, your levels will slowly start to rise as those hormones rise with it. For most people, this phase lasts anywhere from 10 to 20 days. And next is ovulation. This is a phase that most people know about, but we don't know too much about it aside from the fact that it's when you're most likely to get pregnant. So like I said, during your follicular phase, your hormone levels are rising. So when your estrogen starts to peak, then that's what triggers ovulation, and your brain knows to start putting out the luteinizing hormone, or LH. So once ovulation begins, that mature egg that we made back in follicular phase is released and starts to travel down until it gets to our uterus. So as far as symptoms go during ovulation, your basal body temperature actually rises. And in addition to that, your energy levels are at their highest, and a lot of women say that they actually feel most confident during this phase. And a really easy way to tell that you're ovulating in terms of external symptoms is the consistency of your discharge. Isn't it funny that even I have to say discharge with like a weird voice because I'm uncomfortable talking about it? One of the cultural conditioning things that I was talking about. Why can't we talk about discharge? Everyone has it, no one talks about it because it's embarrassing to talk about. But when you ovulate, your discharge becomes like an egg white consistency. It's really thick and very visible. So ovulation typically happens smack dab in the middle of your cycle. So if you have a typical 28-day cycle, it would usually happen on day 14. And while it does only last 24 hours, that does not mean you only have a 24-hour window to get pregnant. We'll talk more about that when we dive into ovulation further, but just know it's not just one day. And after those 24 hours, the egg typically just dies off if it's not fertilized. And now we move into luteal phase, which is the longest phase of your menstrual cycle. The main hormone we're going to be talking about in luteal phase is progesterone. So after that follicle releases the mature egg back in the follicular and ovulatory phases, the follicle actually turns into something called the corpus luteum. We'll talk a lot more about this when we actually get into the luteal phase lesson, but know that this is something that is in charge for the rise of progesterone during this phase. So the rise in your progesterone and also estrogen keeps your uterine lining really thick in preparation for an egg to implant. So if you don't get pregnant, then that corpus luteum starts to shrink away and be reabsorbed back into the body, and this triggers your levels of progesterone and estrogen to start to decrease pretty rapidly. And this decrease in those two hormones starts the cycle all over again, where you will begin your next menstrual phase. So like follicular phase, this phase is typically anywhere from 10 to 20 days. But it's not really until the second half of this phase that we start to experience those PMS symptoms. So about a week before we start our period is typical. And these symptoms are caused by that really rapid decline in the progesterone and estrogen. So this is when most women tend to feel extremely irritable and moody. Their boobs get really sore, they get really bloated, they have trouble sleeping, they have really weird cravings, almost like a pregnancy. And while some symptoms are very normal as your period approaches because your body chemistry is changing, it definitely shouldn't be so severe that it's something that both you, maybe your partner, or even your family and friends dread as you approach this week of PMS. Like I said, we're going to dive into this phase in week 6, but for now, just know that that does not have to be your normal. We've all been led to believe that the way that we feel during our period and week of PMS is just completely normal, and it's something that we have to deal with as women. But I can assure you, both from a professional and a personal standpoint, that that is simply not true. I had really terrible periods, and the week of PMS was insane. And it's funny because I was just talking to my husband this last week about how different it is now not having these crazy symptoms before your period. And although I'm so thankful, it's funny that it almost seems inconvenient, because I used to know exactly when I was going to start my period without having to track my cycle, because my boobs would start hurting really bad, I got super bloated, and I just wanted to kill everyone. But now that I've balanced my hormones and my cycle flows a lot smoother, I don't really have a huge indicator of when I'm going to start my period, except for just knowing based on the way that I track my cycle that I'm going to start. And this is the way it should be. The only thing that we should really be feeling is maybe a little bit of fatigue as our body is kind of preparing for this thing to happen. It does take a little bit of energy to start shedding that lining, so we naturally just feel a little more lethargic, and that's okay. That's a way of our body telling us that we need to rest, because we do. It's really important to rest during that phase. So if you don't already, I would love for you this week to find an app that you like to start tracking your cycle and understanding what phase you're in. That way, when we move forward and start talking about the phases in depth and also ways to support your body during each phase, you already have an idea of where you're at and you can get started. So for our worksheet this week, the first question I have for you is, could you name the 4 phases of your cycle before this lecture? And if so, where and how did you learn? And then also, what are some common symptoms that you experience during each phase? And if you weren't aware of your follicular or luteal phases, just focus on the symptoms that you experience during your period and during your PMS week. And then finally, like I've said, if you don't already, start tracking your cycle. I personally use MyFlow because it actually tells you which phase you're in. Some apps don't do this, but it's really easy to figure out. Like I said, it's just the in-between times of your period and when you ovulate. But I will link some other apps down below that you can look at and see which one you might like best. And don't forget to share your answers in the private Facebook group so we can get some discussion going. Alright, that's it for week 2. I look forward to seeing you next week, and in the meantime, sending you all the love and health and healing your way. Bye.